Hola, hemos llegado al final de nuestra serie Pensar la Igualdad.
Hi, we
A lo
have
largo de
reached the
estos
end of our
11
series,
episodios hemos explorado
Thinking
las
Equality.
complejidades de la
Over the
desigualdad
course of
en
11
Latinoamérica y el
episodes, we
Caribe.
have
Una
explored the
región que,
complexities
si bien
of
ha experimentado
inequality
avances,
in
sigue
the LAC
siendo la
region,
más
which
desigual.
has experienced
Hoy
progress
vamos a
but
repasar
remains the most
algunos lugares del
unequal
viaje hasta
region in
aquí,
the world.
pero
We'll
también
now review
algunos de
some
los retos.
headlines of the
Para
journey up
ello
to
me
here, but
acompañan
we also
dos
want to
invitados
discuss the future,
especiales.
for which I'm
Alejandro
joined by
Werner,
two exceptional
director del
guests.
Instituto de las
Alejandro
Américas
Werner,
de la Universidad de
director of the
Georgetown y el
Americas
subsecretario Hacienda y
Institute
Crédito
of
Público de México,
Georgetown
y
University,
Francisco Chico
and
Ferreira,
Undersecretary
profesor del
for
London School
Public
of
Credit in
Economics y uno de los
Mexico, and
principales
a
y
professor from the
principal
London
teórico
School of
económico.
Economics, and also
Esta
a
red, la CIR,
major
es una
force
colaboración entre el BID,
within CIR, which
LSI
is a
y el
network
Institute for
that
Fiscal Studies.
represents a cooperation between
Participaron
the
más de 60
IDB
académicos de
and the
diferentes
Institute
centros y
for Fiscal
universidades
Studies,
en los
with
trabajos que
academics
exploramos las
from
causas
over 60
profundas de la desigualdad,
centers and universities.
incluyendo
We
los
explore
legados
the
históricos
profound
como la
causes
esclavitud y
of
la colonización,
inequality,
que configuran
including such
importando las
historical
estructuras
legacies like
sociales y económicas
slavery
de la
and
región.
colonization, which
Desafíos
impact
inmediatos
the
como la
social and
informalidad
economic
laboral,
structures in the region.
sistemas de
Immediate
seguridad
challenges
social
like
desiguales
labor
y brechas
informality,
educativas que limitan las
unequal social
oportunidades de
security
progreso para
systems,
muchos.
and education gaps that
Políticas públicas
limit
que a veces,
the
sin
opportunities for
intención,
progress
pueden
for many.
perpetuar
And
las
public policies
desigualdades en
may
largas
sometimes
reducciones.
unintentionally
Pero a
perpetuate
pesar de estos
inequalities rather than
desafíos,
reduce
también
them.
hemos
But
encontrado
despite the
motivos para
challenges,
ser
we have also
optimistas.
found
Expertos y
reasons for
académicos de la CIR nos
optimism.
han mostrado que
Experts
la
and
desigualdad
academics from
no
CIR
es
have shown us
inevitable.
that inequality
Existen
is not
soluciones. A
inevitable.
lo largo de la serie
There
hemos
are
aprendido
solutions.
sobre la
And throughout
importancia
the
de la
series,
educación de
we have
calidad
learned
como
about
motor de
the
movilidad
importance
social
of
y
quality
herramienta para
education as an
romper los
engine
ciclos de
for
pobreza.
social
La
mobility
necesidad de
and to
sistemas de
break the
salud
cycles of
más
poverty, the
equitativos que
need for more
garanticen el acceso a
equitable
servicios de
health
calidad para
systems that
todos,
guarantee access to
independientemente de
quality
su origen
services
o
for all,
condición
regardless
socioeconómica.
of origin or
Políticas fiscales
socioeconomic
más
condition.
inteligentes que
More
promuevan un crecimiento económico
smart
inclusivo y
fiscal
generen empleos
policies that
formales y
promote more
productivos.
inclusive growth
El
and
papel
development and
crucial de la
create more
inversión en la
formal
primera
and
infancia
productive jobs.
para
The
asegurar
crucial
un futuro más
role
justo
of
e
investment
igualitario.
in early childhood to ensure
Comencemos
a
con una
more
reflexión inicial,
just
Chico.
and egalitarian future.
¿Cuáles
We
fueron los
start with
hallazgos más
some
sorprendentes de los
initial
estudios de la CIR
reflections,
que no
Chico. What
esperabas
were the
encontrar?
most surprising findings of the
Bueno,
SEARCH
muchas
study that you
gracias, Ana
weren't
María,
expecting to
por
find?
la
First of
invitación, por
all,
estar aquí.
thank you, Ana Maria, for the
Recuerdo
invitation
haber
to be here.
participado
It
en el
is indeed a
primero de
pleasure.
estos
I remember
podcasts y es un
having
gusto estar
been
en el
on the
fondo
first one of the
con ustedes.
podcasts, and it's a
Y
pleasure
pido
to be here with
disculpas a lo
Alejandro and
público
yourself.
por mi
And
portuñol,
I
porque soy
apologize
brasileño,
to
pero vamos a
the
intentar.
audience for my Portuñol, my
Hay
mix
tantos
of
hallazgos, ¿no?
Portuguese and
Muchos
Spanish. I'm
hallazgos
Brazilian,
porque
but we'll
son
try and do our
27
best. There are many
trabajos
findings. There are
sobre todos los temas
27
posibles
studies
alrededor de ese tema de
covering all
desigualdad.
possible
Pero yo creo que
topics
uno
in connection with inequality. But I think
que me
that one
sorprendió un
that
poco, que no me esperaba encontrar,
particularly
es el
surprised
doble
me, as I
desafío
wasn't
que hay
expecting to find this, has to do with a
en la
sort of
estructura
twofold challenge
industrial
that
de América
exists in terms
Latina y
of
su
the industrial
interacción del
structure of
mercado
Latin America
laboral. Y me
and its
explico. Por
interaction
un
with the
lado,
labor market. Let me
aprendemos
explain
que las
myself.
firmas en
On the one hand,
Latinoamérica tienden a
we
ser
learned that
demasiado
businesses
pequeñas.
in
Hay
Latin
pocas
America
de
tend to
las
be too
grandes y
small.
medias que son
Um,
las que
there are
tienen
only
empleos mejores, ¿no? Entonces
a
el problema ahí
few
es que las
medium and
empresas
larger
grandes
size
pagan
companies that
salarios
offer better
mejores,
jobs.
dan condiciones
Larger
mejores.
companies offer
Entonces,
better
la verdad es que tenemos
salaries and
comparadores con
better
regiones
conditions.
de
So
otros
compared to
países
other regions and
desarrollados, más
countries,
desarrollados,
especially the most developed
una
ones,
tabla muy larga de
we
empresas
have
muy chicas con baja productividad.
a whole
Pero por otro
lot
lado,
of
otros
very
retos
small
nos
firms with
enseñan
low
que
productivity. But
tenemos un
other
problema de
studies,
firmas con muy
on the
grande
other
volumen de
hand,
mercado.
say that we have a
Principalmente
problem
poder de
to do
mercado en
with
el mercado
a
laboral. O sea,
few
que
companies
pagan a
with
sus
very large
trabajadores
power, especially
menos que
the
el salario
market
competitivo
power they have,
del
which means
Producto
that they
Marginal del
pay
Trabajo. Eso
their
quiere decir,
workers
por un
less
lado, no
than
tenemos
competitive salaries.
suficientes empresas grandes
So on the one hand, we
y
don't have
por otro lado,
enough
las que tenemos
large and
tienen demasiado poder
medium-sized
de mercado.
businesses, and the ones
Eso
that we
entonces
do
significa
have
que
too
hay
much
problemas en
market
los dos
power, which
lados
means that there are
del mercado
problems
laboral, ¿no?
on
Y
both
eso me parece
sides
que es un reto porque
of
no
the
es un
labor
asunto
market, which I think
único
is a
de la
challenge.
gente
It's not
corregir,
something
tiene
that
que ver con toda la
government can immediately
estructura
correct. It's got to do with the whole
productiva de la región, digamos.
productive structure in the
Y
region.
esto además, Chico, hace que la
And,
relación entre
Chico,
desigualdad
this
y
also
empleo
means
y
that the
futura
link between
productividad también se ve
inequality
por esa
and
relación entre las
productivity and
firmas
growth
y la
is
desigualdad. Cuando
also
hablamos en el primer podcast,
marked
tú
by
mencionabas
the
que la
link
desigualdad
between
tampoco es
firms
deseable
and inequality.
porque
You
tiene
said
efectos sobre crecimiento
earlier
y
that
estos también
inequality is not desirable, among other reasons, because it impacts growth. And that's one of the channels through which inequality may create growth problems. Again, it's the same dynamics that will create less growth and more inequality. And I would like to talk about one of the most unjust realities of inequality. Inequality has an impact on people even before they're born, and it builds up over the course of people's lives. You've been studying this phenomenon for quite some time, Chico, and you found how inherited factors play an important role in terms of inequality in Latin America and the region. Let's use a hypothetical example so our audience and viewers may understand well what the impact of these inequalities is. Let's think about two people with different starting points. We have a girl born in a rural area with limited resources and a child born in a city with parents who've attended university. How could these different starting points have an influence on the rest of their lives and their opportunities for income as well? Yes, a very interesting hypothetical scenario. Let's think about how we organize the project, because obviously the differences between the boy and the girl build up over the course of their life cycles. So it starts at home, before schools, in early childhood. The girl in the rural setting, in some countries in Latin America, this means that you may not necessarily have access to clean water at home or to sanitation. So there's a greater risk of disease, of communicable diseases in a poorer rural area than in the case of a child that, having university graduates as parents, probably lives in a home with access to services and is exposed to fewer health or disease risks. Of course, there will also be an effect in terms of the cognitive development of the children. The boy will probably have access to a wider range of vocabulary than the girl, due to the educational background of the parents. Not that the girl's parents don't want to pass things on to the girl. They have more limited resources. And when they get to school, they will already have different advantages and disadvantages due to that initial phase that has to do with development in early childhood. So when they get to school, they will go through very different experiences. Possibly the boy whose parents attended university in a large city will attend a private school. One of the findings in our studies, something we already knew, but it's very well documented, has to do with the major advantage in having access to private schooling. Unfortunately, public state schools in Latin America in general don't teach as well as private schools. The girl may go to a public school that offers poor quality in rural areas. There might also be some geographical disadvantages as compared to an urban setting. So the boy will probably make it to university and the girl probably not, due to her starting conditions and the quality of school, even though only in terms of gender, across the whole region, girls study more years than boys. You see, that's a different sort of advantage. But when they get to the labor market, I go back to what I said earlier, the boy will probably get a job in a large company, he will be formally employed, will have all sorts of benefits, and the girl, depending on what country she's in, she may be working in some subsistence agriculture and some informal rural activities. So the lives will be completely different, and there's going to be a difference in terms of life expectancy, with lower life quality, lower income, and that will also become the rule for the next generation. That would be a stylized way of looking at it. Very sad what you mentioned, because through the official educational system, we haven't been able to really somehow cut that Gordian knot between the situation of the parents and the children who inherit the socioeconomic background of the parents. They don't have options, and this perpetuates this persistent inequality in the region. And you talked about gender. I would like for us to talk a bit about that. In the chapter we wrote on gender, we looked at how social norms have overburdened girls with care duties, having an impact on their labor market participation and income. How can expanding early childhood public services help bridge those gaps and somehow contribute to achieving that equal opportunity we so much long for? Well, it's a policy with a double dividend. It pays back in two ways. It offers two advantages. On the one hand, if we are talking about good quality, and this needs to be stressed, it needs to be good quality education. In that case, early education can add to the transmission of knowledge and to the boy or girl being prepared in that critical phase from 0 to 5 years. We've learned a lot about that from economics and other disciplines. That's the time during which a person's brain is significantly developed. So the stimulus they get through play, through group work, and all of things you will find in an early education center is very important to help that boy or girl get to school with greater capacity to learn and make progress. And it also helps a mother go back to work if someone is looking after their son or daughter, which of course means more income for the household and for herself. And it may also reduce the child penalty, the cost of being a mother, which happens to be one of the sources of the reasons for the wage gap between men and women in many parts of the world, including in Latin America. Of course, it's not the only factor, but it's significant. We see in many studies that the gap between men and women having comparable conditions widens at the time of birth of the first child. And that's generally the case because the company knows that the mother won't be coming back or won't be coming back for at least some time. If there's an early education culture and the mother has a chance to go back at least to part-time work, that can also help reduce the inequalities in the labor market as well. And that would be very important because women account for 50% of the workforce, potential workforce. And as we said at the beginning, there are some immediate challenges. And I would like to ask you, Alejandro, a little bit about this, because often we see that the technical or academic recommendations somehow clash with political reality, especially when it comes to complex issues such as pensions or social security. Those policies also have an impact on interest groups, and this may hinder reforms, especially when you have fiscal constraints in the region that are significant. Based on your experience, what strategies can governments adopt to move towards a social security coverage system that is more equitable, on the understanding that it's a politically complex and sensitive issue and as part of the public agenda? Thank you to you, and of course it's a pleasure to be here with Chico as well. It's been a pleasure to follow the SEER project, which I thought was particularly necessary, and I think that the IDB and other project participants are doing very important work for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's important to understand better all of the issues relating to distribution and other factors, and let us hope we can move up at least one notch in terms of enhancing public policy approaches. And as you say, the fiscal situation today and always in Latin America means that we move from one fiscal reform to the next, but we never really solve the medium-term fiscal issue so as to truly have a system that will let us address the needs in a structural fashion. We have relatively high debt levels. expected growth is low. Many analysts say it may be the Latin America decade because it is a region that is not crucial in terms of geopolitical tensions. It has a wealth of raw materials. It is younger than other parts of the world, which places it in a good position for the energy transition to absorb investments from other regions. But we don't yet see the analysts reflecting such potential. We don't see great growth potential for the next 2, 5, or 7 years, and we don't see much political willingness to undertake fiscal and tax reforms that will create a more efficient and just system. So I think your point is crucial. When you look at social security and pensions, we have a major need to seek the right balance between inter and intra-generational distribution, and also with a focus on the financial aspects of these systems. And when it comes to medical coverage, clearly there are quality gaps in coverage and efficiency gaps. And some sweeping reforms would obviously include a significant cost. And the fiscal focus will today be addressing some more immediate issues. And without claiming to be an expert on social policies, having worked indirectly on that through the Finance Secretariat and the IMF, I would say that several reforms have taken place, such as defined contribution systems, and some significant pillars have been introduced with minimum pensions and non-contributory pension schemes, this over the past decade. And given the lack of resources and the fiscal challenges, I dare say we need a significant systemic reflection on what our redistributive desire is when it comes to pensions and what our capacity is to support that goal. And what is the right mix between defined contribution or benefit schemes and, on the other hand, what about the governance that will ensure the sustainability of such systems over time? Because many of those systems, when they do accumulate a significant wealth of funds, end up being used to solve the problems. Well, we saw that during the COVID period. So we need to really take a structured approach to these issues, and we need to at least try and engage in some baby steps within the current fiscal constraints. When it comes to the health front, I think we need to work a lot more on quality, on efficiency, and on coverage to the extent permitted by resources. You see, it is very hard to ask societies for trade-offs between taxes and health coverage if we don't know how much a society values what we offer. I think much of the work done by the IDB and SEER basically assumes that contributions to social security and are basically in the nature of taxes. If people continue to regard this as taxes, it means they value the service we provide at zero. We need to understand exactly how they value that and what can we do to improve the perception, and in that way present a more realistic trade-off so that people may be willing to accept the trade-off to have health coverage. And I think it's important to place emphasis on the administrative part and the efficiency of our healthcare systems. And finally, I would say it is important to consider the creation of a national poverty, income distribution, and social mobility council to really put this on the same level we have, for example, in the case of the Fiscal Stability Council. If we can actually put these issues on an equal footing with other topics that are addressed, and if we can at least move gradually, having some kind of a periodic assessment and with political support, that can create also the sort of political readiness to carry out fiscal reforms that will sustain the structural reforms that this kind of project would require. Yes, and at the IDB, we think it is very important to generate data and evidence to support precisely that kind of initiative, considering also the need for consensus. I think CIR offers a lot of analysis and data that may be very relevant to discussions in countries. And at the IDB, we're also willing to continue to generate evidence to support countries in their discussions. And Alejandro, you mentioned something I think is very important. And this is something we have found over the course of our whole podcast series. Very often we're very hard on ourselves in the region. We think that we do everything wrong, but some things we have done well. Pensions, for instance. Mexico has recently enacted a significant pension reform, and over the course of the 11 episodes, we have found several examples of things the region has done right. Policy innovations, for instance. So it is important to stress that we can also do some important and interesting things. Chico, at CIR we also study racial inequalities in the region, which are significant. And we also study, in one of the episodes, the policies that may be implemented to reduce the racial inequalities. Affirmative action in Brazil has proven effective to reduce inequality, including in access to university education. To what extent do you think those policies can be adapted successfully in other contexts? For example, transferring affirmative action from Brazil to Chile or from Sao Paulo to Mexico City. Before I answer your question, let me say that I think Alejandro's idea regarding the National Poverty, Equality and Social Mobility Councils is great, so as to really beef up the political weight and enhance the visibility of the issue as part of the political debate. You see, the interventions we are talking about are quintessentially interministerial. They require coordination and prioritization across ministries. So a council that could give a hand with that would be very useful. So I think that's a great idea. Now, on affirmative action policies and policies to reduce racial inequalities, it is always difficult to transfer something that worked in a certain place and context to another, because the context may be different. But I think there are some important lessons we have learned from our experiences in Brazil. The quotas and affirmative policies in education for Afro-descendants, in the case of Brazil, do work. But they need to be well designed, as they may also have some undesirable effects. If the quotas are very large, it may end up reducing the incentive for students who have to study for a certain exam. You see, there are also some negative effects that you need to take into account, which is not to say that we shouldn't engage in that sort of policy, but we need to design them properly and really study very well the extent, scope, and type of affirmative action that we could implement. One thing we did see in Brazil was we took a look at what it is to be black in Brazil. This is quite subjective. We all have a bit of that. The skin color may change. It's not like in the States when people say, I am not. You know, it's a whole continuum And obviously, dealing with that from a policy perspective can be a challenge. And that, of course, can be a challenge if you try to transfer that to, I don't know, for affirmative action for indigenous peoples in Bolivia or in other countries like Mexico, because the extent is always an issue. So I think one thing that is interesting, another innovation that was carried out in Brazil, and perhaps also elsewhere, had to do with perceiving that race is correlated with something else. If a child comes from public schools or if they live in certain neighborhoods. So affirmative action policies based on non-racial characteristics, which are, however, correlated with race, may have a similar effect and may even be met with less political resistance, as opposed to things that are explicitly racial. We have seen this in the States. The laws on that were changed, and universities and other agencies are now going into affirmative action models that are not based on race.
And now we come to the most important question, which is how to build a less unequal region. And we've been discussing this. It is not easy, because behind this exercise that we conducted with LACIR, Chico, and from the institute that you had, Alejandro, where do you believe that we have our blind points? What do we still have to study, to investigate, to do research in the future? LACIR, as Chico said, developed 27 documents, but we still have some things to work on. We always said we were missing this or the other one, we still have to work on this or the other one. What do you think we have to do, Alejandro, in addition to this? I know that the question is very broad. Well, deep down, I believe that all this work at the end of the day forces us to think about this, to ponder upon the situation, and to reconsider and rethink about our own prejudices against the trade-offs between distribution and growth, or the different policies that we present, where we had a problem with a diagnosis, and maybe how do we help in order to move the discussion on economic policy more towards a center. Let's say this environment, this surrounding that is politically polarized, but I would say that also in terms of models of the economy, we are also seeing a movement towards polarization. So in that regard, maybe many years ago when Latin America was just coming out of macroeconomic, serious, severe macroeconomic problems, in a way, we overestimate the impact on growth. Not to have a better name to be given to what was being followed by the Washington consensus and the trickle-down economics that this was going to bring in terms of the distribution of income. And this is bringing about, as a reaction, a movement towards models that perhaps are focusing in an exaggerated fashion on the distribution, in mitigating poverty, by less focus on economic growth, and maybe with a less focus even on social mobility. And I believe that the impact on both sides is to ponder upon this in order to move to a model where their state is a powerful state, but we have to be ready. And this is many of the issues that Chico was bringing up and that emerge from the study conducted by LACIR. For example, the issue of racial discrimination, the issue of market power. I believe that the issue of competition is crucial, and sometimes we just touch on it barely. And also the judicial branch, which I believe is discussed in LACIR, and problems of access to the judicial branch, and the same discrimination that we see and how it takes care of different sectors of the population. Chico also brought up at the beginning another thing, which is at the beginning of the podcast in his intervention. He mentioned the problems in access to the labor labor market and also the market power in this market. And so I would think about truly trying to have a state that is more present, more aggressive in dealing with redistribution issues and social mobility issues, particularly with a great emphasis on education, health, early childhood, as it comes out of this study on competition and goods market, but also on markets of factors. And it seems to me that we should also think about the structural issues such as the judicial branch and how to do more effective, faster, agile justice. At the end of the day, when we have judicial systems that take 5 years to solve a labor issue, clearly the most affected person in this is a worker, not the company. So to have arbitration mechanisms with the entire progress that has been made in technology, in AI, etc., that could allow us to have very speedy, very quick arbitration processes in order to solve conflicts where the economic imbalance is so great, so huge between the company and the worker, between the first decile and the fourth decile, and that they would truly close these gaps. So in conclusion, what I would say is that we must have a broader approach, interdisciplinary approach, but also very clear as to where the state ought to be placed in a very clear way and very present, and where we have to leave the private market to do its job in order to have a much more dynamic economic growth that will develop employment and jobs and will give a push to a better distribution of income. And that has to do with the boards and the councils that you're proposing, because on the one hand, we have the studies on where the state should be placed, and on the other one, where society wants the state to be, because these are political decisions that have to be discussed in society, and this could be a very interesting discussion. Chico, please. I have no disagreement whatsoever with what Alejandro was saying. It seems to me that all these issues are very important, and they're very general issues that were mentioned by Alejandro in terms of the design of the state and the boundary between the state and the private market and how to take care of that. And I perfectly agree with that. And I believe that an issue that, to my mind, seems to be extremely important and which is part of that problem is how to have a redistribution in the most efficient way possible in a context of a lot of informality and huge inequality in productivity. And let me explain what I mean by this. When you take a look at the world, besides the Latin American region, and you take a look at the countries that are able to have this inequality, both in terms of results as well as in opportunity, of the lowest level of inequalities. What are the countries that have more mobility, less inequality in opportunities, and inequality in income? These are countries where we have an active state in redistributing, such as the Scandinavian countries in north of Europe, Finland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, but they're able to do it in a context where workers are quite productive, where companies in a general way are all formal. There's very little informality. And these are issues that have been debated in the LACIR project, but even before LACIR by people such as Santiago Levy and others. And that is precisely the topic on how we can design redistributed policies in Latin America without creating incentives towards informality. In a certain way, why our economies and our labor markets are quite dual, I would say. We do see this duality between the formal market and the informal market. And the policies towards each one of these were developed independently. So we have transfer policies that have nothing to do with the formal market, and we have other transfer policies for the formal market. And on the border, this leads to problems in incentives, problems that also have to do with the productivity of these businesses, of these companies, and everything we've been talking about before. So it seems to me that it would be quite difficult, and it will be very difficult to reduce these inequalities in Latin America without active redistribution by the government. It seems to me that the dynamics, the persistence of inequalities over life and from one generation to the next is so strong that in order to break this down, we need a strong political action. But on the other hand, how to have this redistribution in a context where the poorest workers, the poorest families that should be receiving these contributions have a very low productivity, and therefore they could have incentives or disincentives that are quite significant in the labor market. So we have to design a system of a redistribution that would be compatible with the dual economies that we have, and also with the problem of incentives in this context. It seems to me that this, in a way, is a challenge. To my mind, this is the main challenge to be faced in Latin America. Ana Maria says, Alejandro, if you allow me, I fully agree with what Chico was saying. What I also wanted to say is that we have to move. We know that growth in itself will be less than what we always want it to be. And the redistribution effect, the redistributive effect prior to fiscal intervention would be less than what we thought. So clearly, in order to attain a socially fair balance that would give us growth with the redistribution that we want, and on top of it, for it to be politically sustainable, we need distributed policies that are more aggressive, that are broader, designed in line with what Chico said, and also to think of generating corrections of market failures in markets of goods and services, goods and products that have a problem of distribution, and the problem of competition that is very well dealt in LACID. So the problems or the policies that I promoted, that I used to promote at the IMF and now at the IDB, maybe the competition issue is not up to par as it should be, and maybe we should give it a light push, a slight push forward, and then to think about whether we want to create certain distortions in the pre-fiscal distribution that would create not such large distortions on the production side, but that it would improve income distribution in a positive way, such as it could be in the labor market. And I believe that we have to think about our model, the model of Latin America and the Caribbean, in order to reduce inequalities, where we have huge inequalities. In the episode that we discussed with Santiago Levy, he was saying that this inequality is due to the fact that in part we attempted to be like the Nordic countries with our social programs without being prepared and without having the economic development in order to do that, and we ended up having this dual situation that we currently have. It is also important to understand, and ultimately this is what you're both saying, how can we have policies, both policies, to create a reduction in inequality and promote productivity, to come to the point where we can generate both things. It is very important, and we want to promote that at the IDB. And one of the major contributions of LACID is what Chico was mentioning, and what you were emphasizing, Alejandro, about competition, on how the problems that we have in the productive sector are also translated into greater inequality, and we must have more policies that will reduce that lack of competition that we have in the region. In fact, at the IDB next year, our main document will be on productivity, competition, and inequality. That will be our flagship document. We will look at all these issues, and this was an important contribution by LACID. And now I'd like to go into the labor markets. Labor markets, and we knew this before LACID, but this is clearly seen in LACID, they play an important role in order to reduce inequality. And it is one of the most important ways to reduce poverty, which is also a huge problem in the region. Alejandro, what policy of employment generation has been successful according to your experience? Do you have any history, any story that you would like to share with us in connection with that topic? Well, I would say that in terms of employment generation, clearly, what we have to stress and highlight is the countries that followed models that led to greater economic growth in Latin America, such as is the case of Chile, the case of the Dominican Republic, Panama, and recently Paraguay. And from that to income distribution, reducing the wage gap, that is not my field. And the only thing that I would highlight as part of all the critical ideas that we could have in connection with some aspects regarding what we saw in Mexico in the last 6 years in terms of economic growth. But at the other one, we saw a much more active labor policy through, first and foremost, a policy of a minimum wage that raised the minimum wage to levels that do close in a way the gap between the ratio of the minimum wage to the mid-level wage in Mexico when compared to the region. And that without conducting a very detailed econometric study, it is very difficult to find a huge distortion behind this policy. So for me, as an observer, as a spectator watching the labor situation, I would say that this is a trade-off that I can buy in. There was some distortion in the labor market, but I didn't see that at 10,000 feet in altitude, and the reforms in the distribution side are clear. So one part comes from the distortion created by the minimum wages, but I would say that it is a positive distortion in a way, and the other one because of policies that correct mechanisms through which the business sector will essentially evading or dodging Social Security, labor situations that do bring about a favorable impact. So these would be examples that I would highlight in terms of the labor market. And finally, I would mention one that goes to how this whole thing was packaged from some institutions and by some analysts, how they packaged the policies of improvement in the labor market and in Social Security that bring very ambitious proposals. And I would say that sometimes we have to separate all these issues and to focus on the one hand in the labor market without touching on Social Security. And I do believe that in that, what in the U.S. is a negative income tax, or in some countries in Latin America, it is called employment subsidies, which is essentially for the range of between 0 and X minimum wages. 2, 3, where we have to set this limit. The state pays the company instead of the company contributing to the state for the number of workers that you hire. And essentially with this, we eliminate the economic cost of the burden of Social Security, and then we move forward in generating a policy that will promote the formal employment. Yes, and on that I'd like to advertise LACIR, because we have very good chapters on the tax system. And one of the chapters that brings this up precisely, Alejandro, and it would be interesting to explore the possibility of having a negative income tax as a way of achieving redistribution. And the IDB has done a lot on that to try to understand whether this could be an important policy in our countries. Chico. Now we come to the discussion on technology, and the technology, AI, digitalization, and this could be a two-edged sword. It offers opportunities to close gaps on the one hand, but on the other one, it could also deepen these gaps. It could deepen the gaps by concentrating the wealth on the hands of those who control technological platforms, but also the labor markets that, as we were discussing, might bring about significant wage gaps because of the levels of skills. So what types of policies should we be considering, since we will have to deal with artificial intelligence and all this digital transformation that is so important? Well, that's a difficult question. Yes, very difficult. It seems to me that the two ways that you mentioned, saying that technology could increase inequalities, one, the wealth with the owners of platforms, but the other one is in the labor market. The second one is the most important one, I believe. And we've seen that always. We've seen that technological progress do raise the productivity, but they tend to be more complementary for most educated workers. So they're complementary to human capital. So those who have more education get the higher wages, and they tend to earn more than the others with the technology. So that is the main problem, which is the run of the Team Burger, as the economists say, between the increase in education and the increase in technology. Technology increases demand for skills, for rating, and therefore it increases the wage price of the most skilled workers. And the only thing we know is that the response cannot be to block technology. to go against technology, because technology is global. It increases the competition by all, and we have to absorb it. So what we have to do is to train, to prepare our workers in the best way possible so they can benefit from it. And a way of doing that is by raising the educational level to have a good quality of education. And these are issues that we've discussed several times. The issue of quality is essential, not only a number of years of study, but the quality of the education. But we can have other ways of doing this directly, even in terms of training of workers, younger workers essentially, in order to work with new technologies that are coming up in the horizon. That is to say, their efforts focused by the ministries of education and the schools in bringing artificial intelligence and other technologies so that the children will be exposed to it from the very beginning. And that is a strategy of including technology, making it part of education from a very early age, from primary education. And that could be something that could be done. And the last thing I will say is that an interesting thing that we saw in a study on Brazil is that in the last 20 years that there was a drop in the reward for experience. We always think about the rewards or the prize for schooling or the return to schooling, but there's also return to experience, and there's been a return to this that has been a lot pro-equality. It has been quite equalizing, and we believe that this in part comes from the fact that the younger population deals better with technology. This is one of the explanations. It is not the only one, but it is one, and we have to exploit that. And this is one way of doing it, even though the technology tends to be complementary for the most educated people, but they also complement the youngest that earn less. So we could also have a positive impact with that. That's very interesting, Chico. I believe that this is another gap that has to be studied. When we were saying how many other things has to be understood, and what you're mentioning is important, and I also agree that technology and the transformation that are taking place now cannot be stopped because we haven't talked about other gaps, Latin America and the Caribbean with other countries in the world, and how these have grown or expanded, or within the same region, the countries that are far ahead and countries that are lagging behind. So we have to see how we adapt these technologies in the best way possible. At the IDB, we're working hard with the countries in that regard. Our institutional strategy was recently approved. It was approved this year. And the purpose of the institutional strategy is to reduce poverty and inequality, to promote sustained growth and inclusive growth, and to address climate change and environmental degradation. And currently, we are discussing how these three objectives interact in a significant way to see how we define the actions to be taken and followed by the IDB. And we're involved in that discussion, which is not easy, but it's been very interesting. And I'd like to conclude, or before I conclude, I'd like to ask the two of you whether you have anything to add. Do you wish to add anything so that our audience can take this as a conclusion from this conversation? What concrete action can be taken by each one of us so that we can contribute to having a more equitable and fair future in our region? From the individual point of view, I believe that there are some things that we can say. The person who's hearing this podcast at home, what can they do when they listen to this podcast? From an individual point of view, one of the things that we have to accept in Latin America is that we not always follow the rules and the laws. In Brazil, we like saying that Brazil is a paradise with the laws. On paper, everything is working very well. So one of the things that we can do, each one of us, is to pay our employees the minimum wage, to formalize the workers in the company, to pay the taxes that ought to be paid. And those who work for the state or in the state, to be very honest, not to participate in corruption, which is a terrible force in increasing inequality in the region, not only because it creates inequality directly in terms that the corrupt people become richer or wealthier, but also in a significant way in the sense that they reduce the trust, the confidence placed by people in the state. And this was also in some of the documents of La CIR, that people in Latin America in general answers polls or surveys saying, yes, inequality is very high. Are you willing to pay more taxes in order to have the state reduce these? No. Well, it might be that you don't want to pay more, but in many places people say, I don't trust, I don't believe that the state will use these correctly. So each one of us can do our own part, in principle, just to do things correctly, the right way, as they have to be done. From a political point of view, we can take this a step further, I believe, and it seems to me that this is a continuum, but for the didactic purposes, it seems to me that there are two types of countries in fiscal terms. I believe that this is Alejandro's field, and I don't know whether he will agree with me, but in order to simplify things, we have countries where very little tax is paid in the region, and where the issue is to change a little bit the social contract towards allowing to have a bigger state that would have the capability of investing. These are countries that include Mexico, to my mind, that have very low taxes, and many others. And on the other hand, what can people do? To consider the political alternative where the rich people pay a bit more in taxes, monitoring that the state uses them correctly. There's another group of countries where I include mine, Brazil, and also Argentina, and maybe a couple more, where we don't have to pay more taxes. We've paid a lot of taxes, but we spend them incorrectly. We spend them the wrong way. So what we have to see or to do is to question a bit, and I'm addressing this to the people at home, to question a bit. If I have some sort of a privilege that benefits from the state in a way that it shouldn't be, people that receive pensions because they are sons or grandchildren of militaries or those who are judges, and they make huge wages, huge salaries, even greater or bigger than those that we have in other countries, such as England or in other countries. There's one that is contrary to the Robin Hood, the Sheriff of Nottingham, that goes to the rich people within the state sector of some countries in the region. And that's not an easy topic. Many times it is not an issue that an institution such as the IDB can discuss very openly necessarily with the counterparts. But it is there where we have the benefit of being sort of outside, and that has to change. And the IDB and the community have stated this several times, saying that we have to also take a look at this other side of things. So there are things from an individual point of view that can be done, and from the political point of view in terms of towards which social balance are we moving. And essentially, we have to make the decision of playing our role in the social contract, to comply with the laws that already exist, to pay taxes, and to comply with the rules that we have in the different countries. And I would add to this, to make the state spend adequately, to exert the necessary pressure so that the state will spend effectively and efficiently in order to have quality education and health. Alejandro, I fully agree with what Chico said on the social contract. We have Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, countries with huge states, large states, Brazil with high taxes, and Uruguay also, Argentina also, but with a low compliance. And clearly, these are countries where the social expenditure reached a level where if we need taxing at these levels, we don't grow and it doesn't make it sustainable. So clearly, this balance ought to move towards a balance with a less fiscal burden and a more efficient and smaller state. And in the countries with the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, etc., we have smaller states with social problems, perhaps bigger social problems, and perhaps therein we would have to move towards other policies with a greater level of distribution, greater fiscal burden, and also with inefficient expenditure in most of these countries. So as you were saying, Ana Maria, clearly the focus and the efficiency of public expenditure is very important. From the point of view of understanding, I would go back to the point that was made in connection with the following issue. In our countries, we don't insure our cars, we don't buy life insurance, and that is the same thing on the social side of things and public policies. We don't value social security. And as long as we don't attach any value to social security as a society, we will not be very willing to invest in it. And in that, as Chico was saying, part of it can come from a lack of confidence in the government, and another part of this issue, the appraisal or the valuation of the service that is being provided by the state or private institutions through a public-private plan. We believe that it is important to see how society values this social security and what can we do in order to increase that appraisal and that valuation and to bring it closer to what we believe is the social value of what we're proposing when we're pushing for these policies. And one last thing, I want to repeat something. The idea of the negative income tax subsidies on the employment, which is proposed by La CIR, and which has been used in some countries, it is used in the U.S., it is important, and it is a sort of a step up. Instead of redesigning the whole house, we have to begin by the hall at the very entrance, and with this, this could have an important impact, and the issue of competition is essential. It is crucial. Once a Mexican economist that was also the Minister of Finance, Carlos Ursúa, made a study as to what would happen. I was saying Carlos Ursúa, who was the Minister of Finance in Mexico, conducted a study that assessed what would happen if we closed the gaps in competition in a certain way in Mexico, how the distribution of income would improve, bearing in mind the fact that in many of these markets, the poor people consumed a higher share of the consumption basket of goods and services. And they saw that these were orders of magnitude of what we solve in terms of poverty and distribution via the programs of conditioned transfers of cash. So this could have a huge impact on efficiency and growth, but also in terms of distribution and in terms of poverty. And finally, I do believe, at least in keeping with my experience in the government and my experience at the IMF, looking at the day-to-day of the government and how the short term always beats the long term, trying to create levels and institutions and agencies or entities that would focus on the political system and society on such a complex issue. They would focus a government and society on such a complex, multidisciplinary issue, interdependence, as Chico was saying, such as poverty, income distribution, and social mobility, and therefore creating a board or a council, a national council that would look into these issues, that would publish certain reports periodically, would be very important. And last but not least, to conclude from the point of view of the IDB and other institutions, to try to find indicators that would enable us to follow this up continuously. To the concept of social mobility would be important. It seems to me that in La CIR what we see is a lot of issues that point in that direction. And in the public policy, and even much more so in politics itself, we see the urgency of raising the income of the lower deciles, and with that to improve the picture, but we don't know whether we're improving the policy or the movie. And therefore, we've seen that many of the movements of social conflicts that we see in Latin America come or stem from these sectors that were able to come out of the poverty. They were able to increase their revenue or their income in the lower deciles of income distribution, but then they saw their path limited on social progression and for the systems not to be very sustainable. So it seems to me that it would be good to have better indicators that could also raise this issue to the discussion of public policy at the level that it deserves.
Estamos convencidos, como dije, de la importancia de generar
At
datos
the
y de generar
IDB, as I said, we are convinced of the importance of generating data. We'll be creating a group on poverty and inequality that will collect data and information to support good public policy decisions, but also for our own good decisions when we are designing loans and what we do at the IDB. So I agree 100%.
Estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que decía
Yes, I
Alejandro sobre
do
los
quite
datos.
agree with what Alejandro
Es
said on
muy,
data. And
alentador, Ana
what
María,
you
que
said is
tanto
highly
progreso,
encouraging,
uno
Ana
de los
Maria,
progresos
the
en
fact that the
términos de
IDB will be working on that.
mejor
And
monitorear la movilidad
one
en Latinoamérica,
advance in terms of
son,
better monitoring mobility in Latin America
de
has
datos
to do with the
administrativos de una
interlinkages between the
como
admin
hay en
data
Estados Unidos, como hay en muchos
in
otros
one
países. Y
generation
ahora
and
se
the
está
next,
empezando a hacer. Se ha hecho
like you
en
have
Brasil,
in
se ha
the
hecho en
United
Chile,
States
se ha hecho
and
en
now
Uruguay,
in other
y eso nos
countries. It's
permite
been
mensurar
the case in Brazil, in Chile, in
la
Uruguay, and
movilidad
that
de una manera
helps
mucho
measure
más, mucho más
mobility
clara y mucho más
in
precisa de
a
lo que
much
la
clearer
recomendación
and
debate. Entonces, yo creo que ese es un
more
área que
accurate
es
way
bastante
than
importante y Alejandro
used
tiene
to be the
razón.
case.
Si
So I
uno
think that's
no puede
important. And
mensurar,
Alejandro is
no
right.
puede
If
tener
you
datos
can't
en intervalos
measure
cortos, no es
something,
posible
and if you don't
hacer
have
diagnóstico,
short
no es
interval
posible
data,
que eso esté
that
presente
prevents
el
any
debate político de la
diagnosis.
manera
You can't have that
muy
included in the political
Sí, de
debate
hecho
as it
vamos a
should be.
hacer
So
dos
that's very
cosas.
important.
Vamos a
Yes,
crear este
in
grupo
fact,
de
we'll be doing
pobreza y
two
vamos a
things. We'll
crear un
be
grupo de
creating
datos
this group
de
dealing with
manera que
poverty
podamos apoyar a
and
los
also
países
a
pobreza.
group on
Porque tú
data so
mencionas
as to
los países que
support
ya han podido
countries.
entregar los datos
You've talked
intergeneracionales,
about
pero
countries
mi
that
gran
have already
obsesión son
been
los países
able to
que
deal with
no tenemos datos y
intergenerational
de los
data.
cuales
But
conocemos
my
muy poco,
huge
¿no? Porque por lo
obsession is
general
the countries that we have
la existencia de
very
datos está
few
correlacionada
data
con el nivel de
for.
desigualdad del
And
país, ¿no? Entonces los
obviously,
países de los que conocemos menos
data
son los países que
availability
también necesitan más
correlates
apoyo.
with
Entonces nos vamos a concentrar en eso y
much of
esperamos en
the
unos años tener
support that is needed. So we will
resultados
be
que puedan ser
focusing on
útiles.
that and look forward to some
Y bueno,
useful
hemos llegado al
results.
final de este podcast.
So
Confío que ustedes,
we've
nuestra
reached the
audiencia,
end
hayan
of
encontrado en
this
estos
podcast,
episodios
and
fuentes
we
de
hope that
inspiración,
you,
de
our
reflexión
audience,
y que
have
seamos
found
parte de
some
la solución.
inspiration
Estos
and
espacios de
food for
aprendizaje
thought.
colectivo son esenciales
These
para movilizar
collective
cambios. Esa es la
learning
tarea que todos
spaces
compartimos
are
y me
key
incluyo.
to
Como ciudadanos de América
mobilizing
Latina y el Caribe
changes.
debemos
And
seguir
that's our
informándonos,
task as
aprendiendo
citizens
y
in Latin
generando
America and the
evidencia que
Caribbean. We need to
gatille
continue to
transformaciones
get
reales.
information, learn,
Ha sido
and
un
gather
absoluto
evidence that will trigger
privilegio ser anfitriona de
real
esta serie,
transformation. It's been a true
aprender con
privilege to
nuestros
host
invitados y
this
de
series,
ustedes,
to
las voces del
learn
terreno
along
que
with
siempre
our
estuvieron
guests
presentes.
and yourselves, the
Gracias, Chico,
voices and
por
the
haber sido el
ground
mejor
that have
socio de
always been
nuestra
there.
aventura
Thanks,
y por
Chico,
tu
for
incondicional
have been
compromiso en buscar
having
soluciones.
been so
Y
helpful and
gracias,
for your
Alejandro, por sumarte a este
continuous
último
commitment
episodio
to
con tu
finding solutions. And
visión
thanks,
y
Alejandro,
experiencia.
for joining us
Desde el
for
Banco
this last
Interamericano de
episode
Desarrollo
and
les damos
sharing
nuestra
your
gratitud
experience
por
and contributions.
acompañarnos en este viaje.
The IDB would like to
Juntos
thank
podemos
you
construir una
for
región más equitativa
being
y
together
justa
with us
para
on this
todos.
journey. Together, we can
Gracias
build
por
a more
escucharnos. Hasta
equitable and
pronto
just
y
region for all.
gracias.
Thank you for listening. See you soon. Thank you.